Hello all and welcome to Astro Wheel of Fortune. My name is Vlada and I read tarot and I also draw. I do channel drawings. But today I wanted to get into something, and I'm aware that my channel is becoming quite random in its content. But again, like I mentioned before, I kind of like exploring whatever I feel like exploring at the time. And recently, I've really been thinking about dissecting planets in astrology. And so, this is going to be more of an astrology themed video. We're going to be looking at the sun and the moon in astrology. And I have some notes here beside me. What I've been doing lately is journaling about the planets, just on my own, kind of exploring what I think of the planets and how I understand them. And I wanted to have like a little chat about the sun and the moon. I will also do videos on Saturn and Jupiter, Venus and Mars, and Mercury, because I have a lot of journaling on these planets. And I've been getting back into astrology. It's not like I ever left it. It's not like I ever forgot about astrology. It was always part of my practice, whether I was doing tarot or I was doing something else. I'm kind of consistently thinking about astrology, but what I've been really into is really zoning in on very basic parts of astrology and having kind of like conceptual understanding of planets, houses, etc. So today we're doing the sun and the moon. So one thing I wanted to say for this video, especially if you are a Leo rising or a Cancer rising, this video could be very relevant to you because if you're a Leo rising, you are ruled by your sun in your chart. And if you are Cancer rising, you are ruled by your moon in your chart. And what I'm going to talk about here today could really apply to you and the rulership of your planet. Now, at the end of this video, what I'll also be doing is doing a little reading for Leo risings and Cancer risings. So we're going to be doing a reading for your sun ruled charts and for the moon ruled charts, just to kind of tie the reading together. But before I get into that, what I'm going to be doing is having a little chat about the sun and the moon and kind of breaking it down from my perspective. Now, one thing I will say, I'm a self-taught astrologer. I am no expert by any means. I believe that it's very hard to be an expert in astrology as it is such a vast subject and there's so much more to it than most people even realize. And I sometimes think even more to it than I even realize. You know, someone who has been studying astrology since I was 16, someone who has been into astrology since I was 16. You know, in various periods of my life, I was more into it than others, but I feel like over the years, my interest in it has grown and grown and grown and grown. So, let's get into it anyway, and we'll start having a little chat about the sun and the moon. And you know, if you feel like sticking around for the readings at the end, you can do that too. Or if you want to skip to the readings at the end, you can do that. The timestamps will be down below. The one thing I will say is that maybe the chat before the readings might help with understanding the readings, because I anticipate that whatever I'll be talking about here will resonate within the readings when I'm doing them for the sun ruled charts and the moon ruled charts, so Leo risings and Cancer risings. So let's get started anyway. So I wanted to start with I'll also be drawing as I'm doing it, but this is more so for doodling purposes. It's just something that I enjoy drawing and doodling while I talk and while I do things. You can take this as a reading or like a channel drawing if you want to, but you know, this is completely up to you. Maybe we'll tie it in some sort of way, but we'll see, right? So I wanted to start talking about the sun and the moon. So the way that I was thinking about the sun and the moon, so the sun and the moon, I saw it as conscious. Well, we know this. The sun is the conscious mind, right? The conscious mind. And the moon is the subconscious. The subconscious mind. So with the sun, it's the things that we can understand. It's the things that are obvious. It's the things that we can define. A really important thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking about the sun and the moon and how they correlate as planets in astrology. Obviously, they're not planets from astronomy point of view, but in astrology, how they correlate is things that can be defined or easily defined. So defined. And things that cannot be defined. So I'll just write down cannot be defined. So we've got the sun, which is defined. It's the conscious mind. It's something that can be understood. And the moon, which is subconscious mind. It cannot be defined. It cannot really be put into a box. And therefore it can't be ever really fully understood, or it's very difficult to fully understand it. So I really like looking at planets and looking at the vocabulary that we might use to describe these planets, because I think when you look up a certain word or a definition of a certain word, it can really give insight to why we associate certain words with certain planets. But one thing that I was thinking as well with the sun is the obvious, and the moon is the obscure. So I want to just jot down some of these words, because I feel like having these words at hand so that we can have these keywords can help us understand the planets and can help us really connect to the planets and what they represent. So also, I had a couple of words to define the two planets as I was playing around with my journaling about these planets. So I also had distinguishable for sun and discrete for the moon. You know, there's more subtlety to the moon, whereas the sun likes to be more obvious. Maybe, you know, in your face, in inverted commas, whereas the moon is a lot more discreet. It's a lot more subtle. It thrives on subtlety. And of course, as I said, the sun is defined, the moon is undefined or difficult to define or cannot be defined. Another thing about the sun, which I thought was interesting, the sun can represent things that are dependable. Whereas the moon is more about whimsical. I thought dependable, while maybe not direct antonyms of each other, but dependable and whimsical, something stood out to me here, because I feel like they're good definition words to use for the two planets. And I was really thinking about how we see the moon as connected to emotion, as connected to intuition. And something that kept coming up is the idea of doing something on a whim. So doing something on a whim because an emotional urge pushed you to do it, or an intuitive urge made you do it. And something that I was thinking about the moon is how wherever we find the moon in our chart is probably where we can be susceptible to our whims. We're susceptible to our emotions, of course, but I think when we think about emotions, we think about like the individual emotions, like, you know, sadness, whether it be sadness, whether it be joy, whether it be, you know, whatever emotion comes to mind, you know, that kind of like Inside Out from Pixar, like idea of these emotions living in our body. Whim as a concept is very interesting to me, because sometimes emotions can be so subtle they become whims, I think. And so the way that I would almost argue that we could look at the moon is the planet of whim, the planet of like, let me do something on a whim. Let me just do something just because my body, my instincts, my intuition, my emotions somehow came and amalgamated into this whim. And it's not like a whim can't be defined, right? Like if you were to say, what is a whim? Like what is a whim? A whim is just something you decide to do in the moment. A whim is something that comes to you in the moment, but you can't necessarily pinpoint that it's a certain emotion, or you can't necessarily pinpoint that there's a reason for a whim. There's definitely reasons for a whim, but to trace it back to a whim, it's quite hard. And so if we thought of the moon not just as the subconscious and the emotion, I think like assigning the idea of a whim to the moon can help us really understand the moon as a planet in astrology. So, you know, for example, if you had your moon in your seventh house, let's say, if you had your moon in your seventh house, the house of collaboration, one-to-one connections and partnerships, you may look when you look at your seventh house in astrology and you find your moon there, you may notice that you tend to be susceptible to your whims when it comes to your partnerships, when it comes to your one-to-one relationships. There's a lot of whim energy there where you can become very whimsical, but maybe not as dependable, because the moon is not as dependable, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And in these conversations that I'm gonna have on astrology and on all these planets, I really want to walk away from the idea of something being negative or positive and just looking at it from the perspective of this is just what it is. Because if something is undependable or whimsical, it does not mean that it's bad, just as something being dependable is neither good or bad, it just is. So one thing that I also wanted to address with the moon, or the sun and the moon, is the idea that the sun is the ego, right? So ego, because that comes up a lot, right? Like we always hear this. It's, you know, the sun is our ego, the sun is our ego. And I was journaling about this, and what I was thinking about is how we do define our ego, or our ego, more so our ego wants us to define ourselves a lot of the time. Our ego wants to have a dependable definition of who we are. And one thing that I find in spirituality, in astrology, I feel like we are kind of coming out of it, but for a while we were in a place where the ego was seen as negative, or it was seen as something you had to kill off, or something you had to destroy. Your ego was something you had to get rid of, basically. And you know, if we're looking at the sun as part of our chart and something that is a really important part of our chart, which it is, you know, the sun sign is still a very important part of your chart. And again, coming into, you know, the 2020s, I feel a lot of people started to realize, oh, the sun sign, you know, what a lot of people would consider the zodiac sign, you know, the main sign to go by, is not all that. And, you know, a lot of people started realizing, oh, like the moon is really important in the chart, and also so is the rising sign. And, you know, honestly, all of the chart is important. So the sun has kind of like taken, and I wonder, there's something that I do wonder about our society as a whole, like the fact that the sun in astrology has taken a backstage a little bit. I wonder if it does speak to our, in some roundabout way, our ability to put our ego aside lately. And I genuinely do feel like on a collective level, just from what I've noticed, even like in my own personal relationships, and just like observing people and people who are navigating life around me, or people that I speak to, I've noticed that a lot of people are way more willing to put their ego aside. And I feel like there's something to be said for the fact that in astrology lately, we have been really, really cautious to understand that we're not just our sun sign, we're not just our rising sign, whatever. We're all of our chart all at once. It's kind of like, you know, the way all of time moves at once. Time is not linear. It's the same with our chart. Our chart is happening at our chart is happening at the same time. All of our chart is happening at the same time, and it's all important at the same time. And without any element of the chart, it wouldn't make sense. And so, obviously, that's a really important thing to note. But one thing I wanted to say about the sun and the idea of the ego is like, I think we've gone to the point where a lot of us, you know, and I think I was also liable, and I kind of contributed to this idea of like, oh, the ego is bad, or there's something wrong with the ego. The ego just wants to protect, but it's not just about protection. It's really about definition. And when I was journaling about this, I will read some of my notes to you now, but when I was journaling about it, it's, I feel like what the ego tries to do, or what the sun in the chart, in the birth chart tries to do is, I must define myself. You know, it's like the sun is thinking, the ego is thinking, I must define myself and I must have a good definition of myself, because if I don't define myself, the world will define me for me. And I think that's really the role of the ego. It's the fact that if you don't define yourself, if you don't put effort into showing yourself as dependable, showing yourself as defined, showing yourself as like easily understood to at least some degree or another, the world will define you for you. You know, the world will decide who you are. The world will tell you who you are. And so this is where I want to talk about the sun as the ego, and I want to read some of my notes to you. I have a couple of notes here. So let me just start out. Let me find the note that, here we go. So if you overdefine yourself, no, sorry. let me, I have a couple of notes here, so I have to start at the right place. So, okay. No matter how hard the sun tries to define itself, the moon will always break that definition through its whims. So we talked about the moon being the whim, being whimsical, whereas the sun likes to be defined and dependable. No matter how well you try to define yourself, you're always liable to do something that's out of character, right? Because your whims, they exist. You can't get rid of your whims. You can't get rid of your emotions, even if these emotions are undependable, or they may be, you know, whimsical in nature and unpredictable in nature, because that's what emotions are, and feelings are not predictable. They will always be there. And so you have to allow for whims, intuition, and emotion to hit you out of nowhere from time to time, and have that allowance, and have that understanding that even if I am well defined and my ego defines me well in a healthy way, and my ego holds up the definition of me as I would like to be seen, so that the world doesn't define me for me, I still need to understand that the moon will always make sure that I express my whims, my emotions, and my intuition. And so, yeah, you're always liable to do something that's out of character, depending on what emotion or whim comes to you in the moment. Similarly, if you fail to have a healthy definition of yourself and only operate out of your whims and emotion, the world will define you for you, because the moon is the mirror and the reflection. And so if you're only operating out of your whims and out of your emotion, out of your just pure intuition, without any structure around it, without the definition of your character, it's chaos, right? So if we were always just acting out on our immediate emotions, our immediate feelings, if we are always acting out not of what we believed our character and our values to be, because the sun can be values as well. If we don't act out on our own definition of ourselves at all, and we're only saying like, well, I'm just going to act the way that I feel in the moment every single time, that is also toxic and, you know, chaotic, and it's not a healthy way to live, right? And that's why our moon and our sun need to work together. They're kind of keeping each other in check, I suppose, where the sun always makes sure that we have enough definition of ourselves and that we have enough comprehension of ourselves as a human, as a a human being, a human experience, but at the same time, the moon makes sure that we don't over define ourselves to the point where we are trying to act like literally like a character. And I think that's where the moon is really important. The moon is important because it makes sure it keeps us spiritual in a way where it's like the moon makes sure that we don't become a caricature of ourselves, whereas the sun makes sure that we have enough character that we are defined and understandable, or that we can be understood by the people around us, by our society, by and even by ourselves. So another thing I wrote down was ego is important, in brackets the sun, because if you fail to maintain a healthy self-definition, it'll be decided for you. And then I wrote down, if you overdefine yourself, you are imprisoning your moon, not leaving room for healthy expression of changeable human emotion, intuition, and whim. We operate out of our ego until our moon decides to take over on a whim. Again, I want to really highlight, these are my own channelings, these are my own journalings. You don't have to believe specifically what I believe in terms of these ideas. I just feel like I want to share my ideas because this is something that's very fascinating to me, and if you can offer anything to counteract what I'm saying, or if you want to like build on what I'm saying in the comments or anything like that, I'd love to hear it. I think these are just like very interesting discussions to me. And obviously we know a lot of this already, and people who do study astrology, we already know these things, but I think it's still interesting to talk about this and actually really get into in-depth discussions around the planets themselves, the houses themselves, without like trying to make it seem too much like a class, you know, or trying to teach, you know, this is what the first house represents, this is what the second house represents. I'm really into talking about like more conceptual way of looking at astrology, maybe a more chaotic way of looking at astrology, less structured. So another thing that I wrote down was unhealthy expression of emotion is a sign of an unhealthy ego. And I feel like that's because the moon is the reflection, right? The moon reflects, the moon is the mirror. When the ego is unhealthy, the moon shows that image to the sun through emotion. So if the ego is acting unhealthily, and if the ego is becoming, I'm almost hearing sick, you know, in my head, so I'm wanting to say sick. If the ego is becoming sick, the moon, with its emotions, with its whims, you know, erratic whims maybe, with its maybe unhealthy intuition, where the intuition is not functioning, it's not healthy, maybe intuition turns into anxiety, shows the ego, hey, you have been kind of unhealthy lately. You've been over-defining yourself, or maybe under-defining yourself. Hey, you've been out of balance. And so I'm wanting to show you through my mirroring, through my reflection, because emotions, they're quite obvious, right? Like, it's very hard to ignore our emotions, no matter how hard someone can try, you know? And some people really give it a good go, right? So when we ignore our emotions, we are kind of trying to cover up the reflection for the ego. We're trying to cover up it's like we're trying to cover up the mirror. Why am I seeing an image of like a vampire, and you know the way vampires can't be seen in the mirror, and I'm seeing like a vampire who knows that they can't be seen in the mirror, and they're trying to cover up the mirror so that nobody finds out. And so I think it's really important to look at the moon and the sun from that point of view. It's like the moon kind of keeps the sun in check, but it's from that point of view of like, if you are going to be unhealthy, you know, I'm imagining the moon talking to the sun, the moon expresses to the sun what the sun is, the state the sun is in. That's the way that I look at the two planets. But on the flip side, the way that the sun then keeps the moon in check or balanced is that once the sun sees its own reflection in the moon, and if it doesn't like the reflection that it sees, it reconstructs itself. So, and that's where, we talk about the ego death, or, keeping your ego in check or checking your ego. That's where we go into our ego, into our sun, and we decide, right, what does my ego need to readjust, or how do I need to redefine myself, or maybe do I need to loosen my grip on a certain definition of myself? Do I need to make sure I'm not defining myself by something someone said, because clearly my emotions, my whims, my intuition are sending me emergency signals to let me know that I'm over defining myself, under defining myself, or defining myself in some sort of unbalanced, unhealthy way. And so that's just my perception of the two planets and how they work together. Okay, so I had more notes that I wanted to read. So I have this other note. So let me just read this out. So the moon wants to teach us to be subtle, and that at the end of the day, we can't be truly defined. So subtlety, maybe even meekness, but it's not subtlety in a way that is like, it can be shy, I suppose, with the moon. And I think a lot of people associate moon or Cancer with shyness. But I think it's more about how subtlety can be super powerful, and how being unidentifiable or undefined can be done in a very powerful way. Because if someone can't define you, they can't trap you. They can't put you in a box. And so I feel like with the moon, the idea of keeping things subtle and keeping things undefined, it can come from a point of power. And so I do think what is interesting in today's world, I think Cancer can be seen as a very kind of like, oh, it's like a crybaby kind of sign or whatever. And the truth is, Cancer is a very powerful energy. Cancer energy, it is very nurturing, and it is very it can be very gentle and very supporting of life, but it's also that unidentifiable energy that makes Cancer so powerful. It's that feeling of like this great nurturer, this great emoter, who at the same time, while giving so much nurturing to the world, it's very hard to define. It's very hard to understand, because it comes from a place of pure love. And I feel like in many ways, especially if we are looking at Cancer placements that are expressing themselves in a healthy way and in a developed way, those placements, if a person is nurturing those Cancer placements, Cancer placements act from pure love. So I think, and again, if we think about the moon is merely a reflection of whatever it sees. So keeping that in mind, that people who are ruled by the moon are mirrors. They're Cancer risings, are mirrors to the people around them, and they reflect the stark reality or the beautiful reality of what is going on in the community to the people around them. But it's not so simple, because I do also, Cancer is a cardinal sign. So, and cardinal signs are signs of action and kicking things off. And it's like a very initiating kind of energy. And so Cancer, while being this nurturer and, ruled by the moon, which is very subtle and subliminal and not well defined, it's still an energy that's very decisive, and it's still an energy that is very initiating. So there is a lot of power to the moon, and there's a reason why the moon is so prominent in, witchcraft, various spiritual practices. The moon has this power that is very initiating and very proactive, but at the same time, it can't be very easily defined. It's an energy that is a lot more subtle. And yeah, so let me read more of my notes. So I also had sun thrives on absolutes, moon thrives on the arbitrary or whimsical. I also thought it was interesting because the sun is the ruler of Leo, and Leo is a fixed sign, and another word for something that's fixed is something that's dependable. And I just thought that was interesting because I was thinking of the sun energy as dependable. It's like we depend on the sun, right? We depend on the sun for vitality, for life. And I just thought it was very interesting. Leo is the fixed fire sign ruled by the sun, which is, there's that dependability there. Sun wants to always operate under its own definition of itself, whereas the moon likes to operate from its whims. Again, kind of repeating myself here, but sometimes when you journal, you repeat yourself a lot. So, so another thing I wanted to talk about, again, to bring it back to the conscious and the subconscious, with the sun being the conscious and the moon being the subconscious. So the notes I wrote on that was, for the conscious mind to operate in a healthy way, we must honor our subconscious, even if our subconscious is harder to understand. So for us to understand, the conscious mind is easier to understand to some degree. Not that it's super easy to understand, but the conscious mind is more straightforward and it's more defined. But no matter how much we understand our conscious mind, if we are not honoring, or if we're not paying attention to our subconscious mind, if we're not observing our subconscious mind, our conscious mind begins to feel unwell, or our conscious mind begins to feel confused, because no matter how much we operate from our conscious mind, the subconscious is such an important part of our existence. And if you think about it, we spend most of our time in the subconscious mind, and it is true. It's not even if you think about it, it's literally true. The subconscious mind is where most of our kind of life actually happens. The amount of time that we sleep, the amount of time that we, when you zone out, when you sleep, when you go into autopilot, that's all the subconscious mind. And so while I feel, for me, I feel like it's almost natural to go, well, the sun is the more powerful, the conscious mind is more powerful. It's actually not the case at all, and it's arguable which is more powerful than the other. It's just that the ego, the conscious mind, the sun knows how to define things and make things digestible and understandable, but the force of energy seems to be around the subconscious mind, the moon, the obscure. But it's kind of like, the way that I was looking at it is like this magical energy of the moon. And the moon holds all this whimsical, obscure energy, but it's not something that's able to give life force. And so the moon needs the sun in order to create life force. So the sun creates life force, but it's kind of like the sun in astrology couldn't really create life force efficiently without the moon being there behind the scenes, reflecting from the background. So subconscious doesn't need to be understood. It just needs to be witnessed in many ways. We understand it by witnessing it. So all it wants is space to exist. Emotions just want space to exist. Understanding lies in witnessing. So the moon, the way that I was looking at it, is that the moon, being the subconscious and being the obscure and being the magical, is something to be witnessed in order to be understood, or witnessed without a particular need to understand it. Whereas the conscious wants to be understood. It feels witnessed once it's understood. And a flip happens with the sun or the conscious mind, where, and similarly with the ego, where maybe a person from an ego point of view, from the sun point of view, doesn't feel completely witnessed, or like they've been completely seen or observed for everyone or everything that they are, until they've been understood from an ego point of view. And so what I wrote down was the sun, understand to feel witnessed. So the sun, maybe I'll write this down. Sun, understand to feel witnessed, to feel like you can't see all of me if you don't understand me. I feel like that's the stand that the sun would take. The sun, if it was a person, like, and I think a lot of Leo placements are like that. I feel like a lot of Leo placements feel this need to be deeply understood, because if you don't understand me, almost like a language, if you don't understand me, you can't speak me as a language, then you can't fully witness me. You can't fully experience me if you don't understand me. That's my understanding of the sun, ironically. And then we've got the moon, which is witness to feel understood. So it's like the moon needs to be witnessed and observed in order to be understood. And it may seem almost like the same thing, but they're actually vastly different things, because again, if we look at the moon, which rules Cancer needs to be observed, experienced, and witnessed, and then they'll feel understood. Witness. So, witness to feel understood. So it's kind of like the two work from two different points. The sun works from discover me and understand through understanding and through comprehension. Discover me. So the ego, I suppose you discover your ego through understanding and comprehension. The sun and the conscious mind, you discover your conscious mind through understanding and comprehension. And then the conscious mind, once it's been to a certain level understood and comprehended, it feels witnessed. It feels like it's been observed. It feels like it's been experienced. Whereas with the moon, you witness it or experience it in order to feel understood. So if we were thinking about emotions, for example, there's no point in trying to understand your emotions until you have experienced them, because it's impossible to understand an emotion before you've experienced it. You have to experience the emotion before you understand it. And it's the opposite for your ego. You need to kind of understand and define your ego in order to witness it. And the way that we define our ego is we look at characteristics of other people. We look at characteristics that we like around us, things that we copy from our parents, the kind of values that we're given as children, and we piece them all together, and that's how we witness our ego. We witness it by understanding all the facets that come into our ego. Whereas the moon, it's more like, no, you have to go through the experience first in order to understand something. And I just thought it was a cool way of looking at the two planets and how they operate. I think similar things are important. And again, I think a lot of people will agree, Cancer and Leo placements, there are many similarities between these placements. They're very generous in nature, very loyal. Both can be very nurturing. Very, like, generosity would be a big one that I would attribute to both Cancer and Leo. But it's generosity from different perspectives. It's you know, if with Leo it's generosity from maybe an ego point of view, but again, we want to look at the ego as not the negative, just as neutral. Generosity from an ego point of view may be, I am being generous because I've defined myself as generous. I've made a decision that I am a generous person. I made a conscious effort to decide that I am a generous person. And so a Leo will be, or a Leo placement will be generous, or maybe, you know, a Leo rule or a Leo rising sun ruled person will be generous because they've defined themselves as generous. They've defined themselves as a generous person because that's what they decided through the course of their life, that their ego liked that characteristic, and they wanted to attribute that characteristic to themselves. Whereas the moon ruled person, a Cancer rising, or, you know, a Cancer placement, will be generous because they feel like being generous in the moment, because their emotions are bringing them to be generous. It's not from a place of definition. It comes from a place of, in the moment, I felt like being generous and I felt like sharing, and so I am sharing. And they're two different things, but who's to say that one is better than the other? It's like a reflection. One is the reflection of the other. And so I think looking at it from that point of view can be really helpful when looking at these planets and looking at the signs that are ruled by these planets. So I have more notes. I'm not quite done yet. So here, yeah, there's another thing. Oh, sorry, no, that's the first note that I wanted to read. So we've got Leo. I'll only feel noticed and witnessed once you put effort into understanding me. And I do feel like Leo energy is very like that. And then Cancer is, I'll only feel understood once you put effort into noticing and witnessing me. Again, may seem like the same thing at first, but when you really think about it, they're vastly different experiences. So again, I wrote down, again, a lot of repetition in my journaling. Understand to witness, which is the sun, and witness to understand, which is the moon. I also looked up the definitions of understand and witness. I think looking up definitions of words can just be so helpful in when you're journaling about something and you're trying to really understand it. Literally just looking up definitions of words, even if you might think you know the definition of the word and it might be a very simple word, it just clicks something in your head a lot of the time. And so I wrote down understand. Definition of understand is to perceive the intended meaning of. And I thought that was very interesting from the sun point of view, because the sun, the sun is like my understand planet. Is it how we understand ourselves, I would say, and therefore the world, because when we understand ourselves, we can understand the world through ourselves, right? And again, that's why it's the ego, because the ego perceives things through yourself. So the sun is the understand and the moon is witness. So anything to do with the sun, you must understand in your conscious mind. Anything that's connected to the moon, you must witness in your subconscious. So that's why the moon is closely associated with sleeping and dreaming. And, you know, it's often joked about how, you know, Cancer placements love to sleep. It's, you know, that kind of thing. So because they're so connected to the moon, they're so connected to the subconscious, to sleep, like the state of sleep, the state of hallucination that we call sleep. So if the sun is understand and if the moon is witness, and understands means to perceive the intended meaning of, the ego really cares about the intended meaning being understood by others. So what did I intend to do? And so when we act from our ego or our sun, again, not to be negative or positive about it, but I want to be neutral about it, when we work through that, when we're working, sorry, I'm kind of losing my words. When we're trying to work through our ego, when we're trying to operate from our ego, or we're operating from our ego, we are operating on the basis that we are perceived the way we intend to be perceived, with the intended meaning of, and so that we can be understood. And that's why the ego is not negative or positive. It just is, because the ego seeks to be understood. It seeks to be comprehended with the original intended meaning. So that's the sun. And then when we're looking at the moon, which is more about witnessing, the definition of witness is have knowledge of something from observation or experience. And so when we're operating through our moon, or through our emotions, whims, or intuition, we want to have knowledge of something, or we want people to have knowledge of something, or those around us to have knowledge of something from their observation and experience. I just think that's very relevant for the two planets and how they are represented in our chart. And so maybe, again, applying your sun, maybe looking at your sun in one of your 12 houses in your birth chart, looking at where the sun is, can help you figure out where you seek to be understood from the perspective of, with my intended meaning of how I want to be understood. And then maybe where you see your moon is where you want to be observed, witnessed, experienced. Like, this is the area of my life where I want to be experienced for the person that I am, and not necessarily to be understood or perceived from a place of comprehension. Whereas the sun wants to be comprehended. It's like, comprehend me and understand me. Whereas the moon is like, I don't need you to comprehend me. I don't need you to understand me. I just need you to witness me. I just need you to observe me. That's all I'm asking for. And maybe if we can look at our charts from that perspective, and look at these two planets in our charts from that perspective, that can give us a new level or a new layer of how we look at our emotions. Again, recognizing that emotions, they don't want to be even understood. Of course, you can understand your emotions after a period of time once you've observed them, but the very core of emotions is that they want to be witnessed. They want to be experienced. They want to be observed. And the ego wants to be understood and comprehended. So, is there anything else? Yes, I do have more notes. I apologize. This is a long video. But, yeah, so another thing that I wrote down was the sun wants you to understand its intentions. What did I intend to do? Do you understand what I intended to do? Maybe I didn't do what I intended to do, but please understand my intentions. And so maybe I'll write that down as well. Intent? Okay, we'll write down intentions. So with the sun, it's all about intention. What's my intention to be? What's my intention to achieve? And that's where the ego can come in. And of course, it can be balanced or it can be unbalanced, because intentions, they're not good or bad. You decide, or you, as you move through life, you can see if you're self-aware and if you are connected to yourself, if your intentions are good or bad. But I think that's a really important part of the sun. The sun is all about intention. Where is my intention? And so maybe that's another thing to look at in your birth chart. If you were looking at where the sun is in your birth chart, you could look at, let's say your sun is in your third house, let's say, right? And if the sun is in your third house, is it that you have strong intentions around communication, learning, curiosity? Is it where most of your intentions go into, that area of your life? Maybe it's where you have the best intentions, you know, maybe even like siblings and neighbors, because the third house rules that as well. So do you have a lot of intentions for your, and I would look at it from the perspective of, because intentions can be good or bad, and the sun would represent to me not necessarily good intentions or bad intentions, just intentions in general. Looking at the aspects that other planets make to your sun can then indicate to you what kind of intentions you have for, you know, siblings if it's in your third house, for neighbors, for your smaller communities, your immediate environment, your learning, your interests, your curiosity. And then when we look at the moon wants you to observe its intentions. So if the sun wants you to understand what the original intention was, and what the intention was intended as, almost, the moon is like, well, you observe me, you look at what I'm doing, and you tell me what my intentions were. That's the way that I was visualizing it in my head. It's like the moon is more about, well, what do you think my intentions were? Whereas the sun is like, please let me tell you what my intentions were. So it's not defined intention. It's intention that is observed by the outside, by the external, I suppose. So with the moon, wherever you find the moon in your chart, again, we said the 7th house the last time, so let's keep it with the 7th house. Let's say your moon is in your 7th house. It's where your intentions are mostly observed, and they're not very well defined. Your intentions may be need more structuring. Your intentions may feel like they change as well, because the moon is changeable. So and because we're talking about whims, and we're talking about intuition and emotion, and all of those things are very fluid and very changeable. Maybe that's where you need to look at your intentions and pay attention to what is reflected back to you in that area of life. So in your collaborations, your partnerships, your one-to-one relationships, your intentions may not always be very clear, and your intentions may need to be more structured or more defined. Whereas like in the case of your intentions with the sun, wherever you find the sun in your chart, it may be the case that you need to make sure that just because you intended things a certain way does not mean that that intention was perceived that way. So that's another thing that I thought was interesting about the sun and the moon. And another thing that I wrote down was the sun is all about, let me show you who I am. And I think that's very Leo energy. Let me show you who I am. Let me tell you, show you, and express to you who I am. And the moon is, please observe who I am. And it's, again, very subtle, because there's more control with the sun. There's more control with Leo energy. Like, I'm going to show you. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to express to you who I am. Whereas with the moon, it's like, well, you tell me who I am once you've spent enough time with me and you've observed me enough. So yeah, and what I wrote down, again, I mentioned cardinal signs before, but what I wrote down was Cancer is a cardinal sign, and cardinal signs are the signs that kick things off. They're like, it's this initiation. And why I actually have a theory that Libras have the stereotype, but I won't get into Libras too much because that's not what we're talking about today. But Libras have the stereotype of being very indecisive, but I feel like Libras have the power to be extremely decisive if they're balanced enough. And you can meet some extremely decisive Libras that know exactly what they want, but that's a story for another time. But Cancer energy kicks things off through emotion, instinct, and whim. So that's my notes for this. I do have another note that I wanted. This is just something I was thinking about as well, because the sun is also the rational. It's something that follows reason, might follow logic as well, but it's the rational. And then the moon is the irrational. It's something that cannot be described by logic or reason, cannot be described or defined, as we said. And so that got me thinking about like rational and irrational numbers. And I do think that maths and astrology are super connected. It's just a pity I am not very good at maths. But it is something that I often think about. I have a lot of thoughts on maths and astrology and how closely they actually correlate, and how important understanding of maths, how important understanding of maths can be when we're talking about astrology. And again, as I said, I'm not a mathematician or anything like that. So whatever I'm about to say, I'm not saying this is gospel. Just like, sorry, I'm shaking my camera. Just like anything in this video, I'm not saying any of this is gospel. This is just my own journalings, my own thoughts and ideas on the planet. But what I was thinking about is, so a rational number is a number that can be put into a fraction. And so it's a number that can contain another number without a decimal, I think. That's, so what did I write down? I wrote something down here. So a ratio is the quantitative relation between two amounts showing the number of times one value contains or is contained within the other. And so a rational number would follow that definition, right? We also, so a rational number would be connected to the sun. So rational numbers that one value equally goes into another value, and it can be written as a fraction, that would be connected to the sun. But then we also have irrational numbers that can be infinite, such as the number pi. And I thought pi was so funny because then I was thinking about like that song, and it's like, when the moon hits your eye, like a big pizza pie, that's amore. I was like, the number pi is an irrational number. It's an infinite number. It's not a number that can go into a fraction and be even. There's like an unevenness to it. There is an imperfection to it, but the imperfection does not mean it's wrong or that it doesn't exist. And so I thought the moon being pi, and then, you know, rational numbers for the sun, or, you know, like there's other irrational numbers, but I was just kind of like fixated on pi. There's something interesting there, but of course, again, I'm not a mathematician, and I'm not, oh yeah, what I wrote down was irrational numbers cannot be written as a fraction, so in simple terms. But I was also thinking about the idea of the golden ratio, and the golden ratio is pleasing proportions found in nature. And again, when we look back to the sun being the life force, and the giver of life into nature, I thought the idea of the golden ratio and the fact that it's golden as well, being connected to the sun, being kind of like also an interesting concept if we were to look at it from an astrological point of view. So golden ratio is like, it's pleasing. And so maybe if we were looking at the golden ratio and we were looking at our ego, you know, all both connected to the sun, if we were to argue that, the ego is very concerned with things being proportionate and pleasing, but still natural. A balanced ego is something that is natural, but has pleasing proportions around character. So a balanced character. And so the golden ratio, it's like this perfect, pleasing thing, but something that is still natural, something that doesn't go into almost this uncanny valley of character. I don't know if that makes sense, but and then with the irrational numbers, pi being 1, it's this almost this unexplainable, it's something that can't be fully explained or fully contained, because like, for example, pi, it's an infinite number, it cannot be contained. And I thought that was a very interesting way to correlate that energy with the big pizza pie, that's amore, the moon. So that's what I have in terms of my thoughts, my journalings, my musings on the sun and the moon. That is kind of the extent of it from like so far up to this point, what I've worked on in terms of trying to understand the planets in a more intimate way, beyond just giving them keywords, beyond just, you know, because I think when we really get in depth with like the smallest detail of something, it can really inspire us into understanding a topic as a whole. And I'm really interested in having these conversations. And if you feel like it, please, you know, if you want to give me some feedback, or if you want to have a conversation about it in the comments, if you have your own ideas on this, I'd love to hear it. Feel free to share it if you feel like it. But let's get into, I promised a little reading. So let's do a little reading for both the sun and the moon ruled charts. So if you're a Leo rising or Leo sun, if you feel like applying it to the sun, or the moon, even Leo placements if you feel like it. But I just thought that looking at the rising would be the best, because that's the planet that rules you. It's the ruler of your chart. So if your chart ruler is the sun or the moon, stick around for a reading. So let's start with the sun. So Leo risings, if you're ruled by the sun, your chart is ruled by the sun. Let's look at a little reading for you. We won't do a very long one. We're just going to get some messages for Leo risings. Six of Pentacles in reverse. Three of Cups upright, and I'll get another card, and we've got the Star. So I want to kind of follow whatever we were talking about in the main video. And so what I'm getting, suppose we're looking at your chart ruler, the sun, from that perspective of the ego, defining yourself, needing to be understood. And what I'm seeing is that some of you could be maybe actually over generous. And it's funny that the concept of generosity came up for the topic when we were talking about the astrological side of things. You might be, it's almost like you're being over generous right now, it feels like, with certain people in your life. But it's not even that it's not appreciated. There's something very interesting that I'm picking up on with these cards. Your generosity is appreciated. I feel like a lot of people in your life are appreciating this generosity. And I wonder if a lot of you who are watching this reading are defining yourself through that, you know, I am a generous person. That's the definition. My ego has assigned this definition to me. What I'm seeing is that people know that about you. People are aware of this. You are perceived as a generous person. But if you're not careful, following the topic of the ego and the need to define yourself, you can actually almost over-rely on this character of generosity. And so your guides are saying it's time to pull back on your generosity, not because you're being used for your generosity. I'm not getting that for a lot of you. It's not because you're being used for it. It's not because people are taking advantage of your generosity. It's because you are starting to almost over-define yourself through this character of generosity. And so your guides want you to start looking for new characteristics, new character development for yourself outside of I'm generous. So stepping into some new characteristics, and maybe like there's something about you that is very healing to others. You have some healing energy. Maybe you are someone who gives really great advice. This could also talk about maybe focusing on just one type of generosity. So maybe you are very focused on physical generosity, where you are very generous with your resources, your finances, your effort, like practical effort. And it feels like it may be the time to, if you are still interested in, you know, developing your generosity and the idea of your generous spirit, and that this character arc of you being a very generous person, it could be time to step into generosity that is more healing, from whether it be spiritual point of view or it is generous from a point of view of advice, of giving people hope as well. Something like that is coming through. But I feel like if you're able to step away from defining yourself as generous, not as in you have to stop defining yourself as generous completely, but maybe bringing that character, that assigned character detail of yours to maybe the background, and allowing another character detail of yours or another characteristic of yours to come and shine to the forefront. So I think with the Star card, it's funny because the Star card is ruled by Aquarius, right? And Aquarius is the sister sign of Leo, the opposite sign of Leo. And so if you're a Leo rising, if you're a Leo rising, your descendant is in Aquarius. So your 7th house is in Aquarius. And that's really funny because the 7th house is the house of collaborations, cooperation, one-to-one relationships. So maybe there is a need to connect to your one-to-one relationships from this Aquarian point of view, embracing your 7th house, the sign that your 7th house is in, embracing it from that humanitarian point of view, from the point of view of advice, of the point of view of being very wise with people, being wise with your advice and generous with your advice, and avoiding generosity from a physical financial point of view, but not avoiding it because you're greedy, avoiding it because you've done that part of your character development already and you want to focus. And I am seeing that for some of you, I feel like maybe you're moving into a time where you are moving away from hanging out in groups of people, and it's not necessarily because of anything bad, but you're just starting to become more focused on your one-to-one relationships in your life. So that's the message that I got for you, group, or not group, Leo risings. Sun is your ruler, Leo rising. Maybe check where your sun is in your chart, like which house it's in as well, what sign is it in. Those can be all very interesting things that could help you on your self-discovery as well. So thank you so much for hanging out with me. I really had a great time doing this. I hope you enjoyed it too. If you want to share some feedback with me, I'd love to hear it. But I'm going to move forward into connecting with our Cancer risings, and that's moon-ruled charts. So you're ruled by the moon if you're a Cancer rising. So what message does your moon have for you? Oh my God, we've got the moon! That's so exciting. The moon wants to be seen. Cancer risings. We've got the two, so we've got the 9 of Pentacles in reverse, and we've got the 2 of Swords in reverse. So first of all, with the moon being here, I feel like the moon, or your moon, the moon that rules you, Cancer risings, wherever this moon is in your chart, if you're especially if you can look up where your moon is in your chart, what house your moon is in your chart, what sign your moon is in your chart, wherever you're experiencing, it feels like you might be experiencing some sort of fogginess and uncertainty in that area of life right now. For a lot of you, this could be associated with finances, more physical matters. So it could be that for a lot of you, the moon is either natally there or transiting one of the following houses: 2nd, 8th. Oh, 2nd. No, I'm wrong. Well, I mean, it could be the 2nd house. I feel like it could be the 6th house. I do feel like it could be the 8th house and the 10th house. 2nd, 6th. Yeah, I feel like 2nd, 6th, and 10th are more likely, so there could be some transits going through there. But I feel the 2nd and the 8th house, they're on the same axis, and they both kind of talk about resources. One is about physical resources for yourself, and one can be connected to sharing resources and sharing physical stability. So 8th house could be connected here, but more so 2nd, 6th, and 10th house. You can either have your moon natally or transiting. I feel like what this message is talking about is that embrace this energy of the moon. So whatever we talked about earlier, about the moon and it being connected to whims and it being connected to intentions. The intention part is coming through very strongly. So for a lot of you, maybe you need to define your intentions when it comes to your finances right now. It could be really important to set very, very rigid or structured intentions, because maybe that's where you're lacking currently for a lot of you. If it's not financial and you feel like financially you're okay, it could be more so to do with your physical grounding. So maybe you don't have a lot of intentions around you don't have strong intentions around like physical exercise or enough physical movement to maintain your body, or maybe you don't have enough strong intentions around your physical surroundings. For example, maybe you haven't set very strong intentions for your space, because don't forget, our physicality, yes, it's our body, yes, it's our physical body, but it's also our physical space, the space where we dwell. So setting very strong intentions for your physical space, whether it be the space within your physical body or, your room, your house, your home, that's really important for you right now. And the reason that things are foggy is because the moon, yes, the moon is helpful, where the moon highlights our emotions to us, our whims, our intention, or our intuition, but it's also important to structure that. The moon, your moon, because you're ruled by the moon, you're ruled by your whims, your emotions, and your this kind of mystical subliminal energy. But don't forget that even mystical and subliminal energy can be intended somewhere. It can be directed somewhere. And so what I'm getting as a message is that use this powerful subliminal, whimsical, magical energy, but don't just let it scatter in your life. Don't just let it kind of like move through you without any direction. There is a need to direct it into very specific parts of your life and set very strong intentions with it. But embracing it and really honoring it is also very important. So that's what I have for you, Cancer risings, moon ruled charts. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the chat. Thank you for hanging out with me. I hope you have, I don't know, I hope it gave you some thoughts or ideas about astrology. I hope it drummed up some interest. If you have any feedback to share, please do. And if you like this video, do like and subscribe. But I'm going to leave it here, and I hope you have a good day, and I will talk to you in my next video. Bye!